It'll be 6 weeks about modernism, and tonight I'm going to introduce the topic by giving a little bit of background, introducing some of the main characters for and against modernism, some of the key players, and then just pretty much introduce what the next few lectures will be about and try to tie it together as a proper perspective of what do we do now that we're the recipients, we're reaping what has been sown by others in terms of modernism. The picture on the screen here is the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965. When the changes were introduced following the council, they came with the assurance that the substance of the faith wasn't going to change. These are just new ways of expressing the church's teaching, we were told. It was assumed that the method of teaching, the way of presenting the faith had to be updated to be more relevant to the modern world. It was also assumed that it was absolutely necessary to update the liturgy so that people could relate to the Mass. It soon became apparent, however, that these assurances were meaningless, that in fact, the very doctrines of the faith were being questioned, that in fact, the Reformed liturgy meant a never-ending process of change, that for the most part reflected Protestant theology of liturgy, Protestant theology of the Holy Eucharist. Now, there is no denying the correlation between these changes with the introduction, first of all, of the Novus Ordo Missae in 1969. It was the first Sunday of Advent in 1969 that the Tridentine was now officially abrogated, or at least apparently, I should put it that way, apparently pushed aside, and the new rite was introduced. As a result, there was a drastic decline in church attendance. Obviously, this also corresponds with the catechesis at this time, because children in school were no longer being taught that it's a mortal sin to miss Mass on Sunday. So a lot of it goes together with not just the liturgy, but with the catechesis. But certainly a decline in the faith in the Eucharist. Okay, is the Eucharist that we receive at Mass the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ? Well, of course it is. That was no longer taken for granted. A decline in morality also followed a total disregard for the commandments and for the teachings of the church, especially with regard to marital purity. So, what we really have here is a decline that's started by some type of a revolution in the church. Interestingly enough, a lot of average Catholics knew there was something wrong, especially those who had been brought up on the pre-Vatican II catechisms, very basic question and answer theological texts which summarized the basis of the faith in very clear, unmistakable language. There was no equivocation. It was very clear. It was very simplified, but it was the faith. And so many who were brought up on these pre-Vatican II catechisms knew the basic teaching and morality of the church. And when their children, for example, would come home from parochial school and challenge them on the doctrine of original sin, they knew we had problems in the school. That's a story from my own family. We experienced that. Adam and Eve was just a myth. It was something not historical at all. It was just a way of a literary form of explaining how good and evil got into the world. Transubstantiation was called into question. Everyone knew what it meant. Everyone knew who was properly catechized, knew the truth. The Holy Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. It's not just Jesus somehow present on the altar in some type of a symbolic meaning. What about the church? We used to call the church the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the one true church. That language was totally gone. Now, it seemed as though what they were saying was that the Catholic Church is just one of many different Christian denominations. Our Lady, the saints, miracles, and other important truths of the faith were often ridiculed as something that was outmoded, outdated. Oddly enough, the majority of Catholics were pretty much carried away by this excitement for change. Perhaps this is an indication that their faith, to begin with, was mere formalism. The church ostensibly, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, in this country, seemed vibrant, but maybe there was an indication here that there was more of a hollow shell than the real substance of faith in these people. Very few asked the important question: what is the catalyst for change? What is the driving force for updating? And those attached to the faith and wanted to investigate more closely looked into the confusion and discovered that there was undeniably a well-planned reorientation to reject what the church had always taught regarding faith, regarding morals, regarding liturgy. Everything was now subject to novelty. In fact, it was discovered, lo and behold, that very errors that had been identified and condemned in the 19th and the 20th centuries were now back in full force. And now, not as some esoteric or some underground movements, but apparently with the blessing of some authorities in the church. This is the essence of revolution. Welcome to Partisans of Error. Okay. Now, the revolt, as we've seen, is a lot of it has to do with an evolution, as it were, of the denial of God's rightful dominion, God's rightful authority in this world, as he has so deigned to give authority through his church. So in the following weeks, we're going to try to investigate through the lives and teachings of the villains and the heroes in this intense struggle between truth and error, goodness and evil. We'll try to grasp the meaning, the scope, the import of these errors, and how they affect the church the present day. In so doing, we'll see direct connections, the bad tree producing evil fruit. It's hard to believe, or it's a very interesting to go back and see that what we're dealing with here doesn't start in 1962. It doesn't start in the 1950s. It starts in the 15th century. It starts even before that. It starts with the Renaissance and the turning away from God to man-centered thinking. And this is certainly the case we see in Protestantism, private interpretation, the Bible alone. Okay, so it's no longer the authority of the church, it's no longer the authority that Christ has established. It becomes your personal authority. And then the same thing goes along the way in terms of liberalism. We see that this idea, it's really rationalism in practice. Okay, so the next step is, well, if religion can be toyed with, if religion can be modified according to the whims of the founders of these new religions, why have any religion at all? Why don't we just go by reason? And so the rationalists took over. And so we see not only in theological thought, but also in social and political implications as well. And we'll see that in the rise of communism, socialism, and the like. The intermingling of Catholics and Protestants often led, especially liberal Protestants, led to the Catholics adopting the errors of their Protestant brethren. So it's certainly, for example, European universities and the like. Catholics and Protestants studying together, and the Catholics are being infected by this corruption. And this is what we mean by modernism, the name that was given to it. So, who were the pioneers of this movement? What were the sources of their destructive teachings? How did the popes combat their errors? So we have here the title of our series, the Partisans of Error. This was a book published in 1983 by a man by the name of Michael Davies. And Davies is an interesting story. We can't go through too much detail here, but it turns out that he really identified early on with others in Wales and in England the problems in the church. And to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis by Pope St. Pius X, issued in September 8, 1907, against the Modernists, Davies put together a concise summary describing the so-called actors and the issues of the story. Davies was recognized internationally as the most prolific traditionalist apologist. And as I'm reading his books, it's amazing. You're thinking to yourself, where are the priests? This is a layman. Where are the bishops? Well, yes, there were some good priests and bishops who identified the problem and were active, but this man was really leading the charge in so many respects. He was born in England, Somerset, England, in 1936, of Welsh father and an English mother, and he was raised nominally Protestant. He was a very good student, and he had a great knack for history, and we'll see that in his writings. He's a marvelous writer. Well, he entered into the military service in England and converted to the Catholic faith at the age of 21 in 1957. He passed his studies, the graduate studies, and became a school teacher in both the primary and preparatory levels. And he remained at this post for 30 years, from 1964 to 1994. And this is an amazing fact because he's not only occupying this full-time job as teaching, he's writing these books. And so he probably didn't see his wife too much. He'd come home from work and go to the typewriter, whatever it was at that time, he'd start writing. And he produced an amazing number of beautiful books in defense of the traditional faith. He was blessed with 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons. He was shocked and alarmed. There was again, we talked about that euphoria, or the excitement about change from the Second Vatican Council, and everyone thought, well, this is what God wants. This is the council's being called, and there's going to be good things coming from it, and he was among those. Then he started to see the direction that it was taking, and he was shocked. He was saying to himself, here is the Catholic faith that I joined, but where's the timeless faith, the faith that doesn't change? Well, I'm seeing now what I left, okay? The idea of Protestant liturgy and the like. So he wasn't the type of person who would sit on the sideline and say, okay, let's let somebody else take care of it. He would be right in the action. So 2 years after the formation of the Latin Mass Society for Wales and England, that was founded in 1965, he joined in 1967 to help do what he could. And he started out by just writing some newspaper articles and then a couple of pamphlets, and before long, he was recognized as a voice for tradition. The Latin Mass Society grew. There was one in Wales and England. There were others around Europe. And then they made a federation, and they called it the International Federation of Una Voce Dicentes, Sanctus, Una Voce. And that became a very, very important traditional movement and organization that not only helped preserve the faith in various countries, but organized, it was a voice for traditionalists throughout the world directly to Rome. Very important. And Michael Davies was very much a part of that. The founding president was Dr. Eric Seventem, and today I believe they have about 40 chapters. Michael Davies at one point became the actual president of that. Interesting to note that the work going on in England at this time was noted by the church. Cardinal Heenan, Primate of England, in 1970 obtained from Rome what was called the English Indult. Everyone else was changing to the Novus Ordo, and so was he, so was his country. But he obtained this permission for the Latin Mass to be said on a restricted basis, but it's still in England. And it's no small part due to the work of Michael Davies and the work of the Latin Mass Society in England and Wales. All right. So, Michael Davies, Latin Mass Society, and eventually Una Voce International, gifted writer and lecturer, soon acknowledged as the leading voice for traditionalists throughout the world. Davies was an amiable man. He made friends very easily, and he found many allies in the defense of the faith. He contributed numerous articles to various traditional publications. Father Paul Crane, S.J., in London, who was the producer, the editor of Christian Order. Another one of his friends was a friend of ours, Hamish Fraser from Scotland, with his Approaches publication. And then in the United States, Walter Matt, the founder of The Remnant in the United States. So he wrote for these publications, and then he also wrote numerous books. And again, as I said, served as president of International Federation for Una Voce from 1995, a year after he retired from school teaching, to 2003. His books were quite amazing. The most popular, at least the most well-known in the early days of the fight, were the trilogy which had the subtitle, The Liturgical Revolution. And in 1976, he wrote the first book there, Cranmer's Godly Order. And this was a documentation of the Protestant attack on the Mass in many details, and especially Cranmer's Order in England. Amazingly enough, the second book, Pope John's Council, was published the year after that, 1977, two right in a row. And this documented the sources, what was going on behind the scenes, the Second Vatican Council. And then lastly, in 1980, he published Pope Paul's New Mass, in a critique of the New Rite. He also wrote other books in Apologia for Marcel Lefebvre, Archbishop Lefebvre, the founder of the Seminary of Econ, Switzerland, in 1976, and other titles on the Mass and on the Council. And unfortunately for the traditional world, he died very young. He was only 68 in 2004. Then Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, a few months later, issued this public statement. I have been profoundly touched by the news of the death of Michael Davies. I had the good fortune to meet him on several occasions, and I found him as a man of deep faith, ready to embrace suffering. Ever since the council, he put all his energy into the service of the faith and left us important publications, especially about the sacred liturgy. So the future Benedict XVI had an admiration for the good work that was done by this layman. Now, why is modernism considered the most dangerous of all heresies? St. Pius X called it the synthesis of all error. Paul Hallett, an American journalist, wrote the prologue, the introduction to Davies' book, Partisans of Error. And he points out that while other heresies attacked a particular doctrine, that wasn't the case with modernism. By its very nature, it destroys the foundational belief in the necessity of the supernatural. So that's why it's a synthesis of all error. It makes divine revelation meaningless. It leads to atheism. And while this assertion may seem exaggerated, as we go along with just an overview of the theology tonight, I think you'll see why. By devious means, it takes the appearance of Catholic development of doctrine. It uses Catholic forms and terms to express something different from what the Church has always taught. For our present purposes, we'll look at several aspects of the modernist system. First of all, and don't be surprised if you don't understand some of this. The modernists themselves couldn't explain it, so don't be surprised if you don't get it, all right? All right. First of all, there's a direct correlation between the modernists and the Gnostics. Gnosticism is pre-Christian. Gnosis is knowledge in Greek. And these people believed that they had a superior knowledge. It turns out that they were a form of pantheism, that is, everything in the material universe is God, and the dualism. How do they explain good and evil? Well, they don't say a good God and a bad God. They just say a principle of good and a principle of evil. Okay. Now, these errors were adopted by so-called Christians in the early centuries of the church, and we'll see remnants of this teaching in such groups as the Manichaeans. The Manichaean heresy was basically Gnostic, and this is what poor St. Augustine was wrapped up in for many years and had great difficulty straightening out his mind until St. Ambrose was able to walk him through the process. It later appears as Albigensianism in Europe. Ultimately, not only being pantheistic, all the material universe is somehow God or divine, it denies the divinity of Christ. So, gnosis, Greek, knowledge. Gnostics claimed a superior knowledge of the mysteries of the universe, and that first and foremost mystery is that the universe is divine. One of the most important elements of this knowledge is that it denied the permanence of being. Therefore, there's no principle of identity, contradiction, and causality. It negates the necessity or the possibility of knowing truth. And then, like Immanuel Kant, he would be back in the 1700s, the 18th century, proposed a theory of really kind of a great subjectivism, okay, agnosticism. It's based on teaching like that. Modernism, like Gnosticism, affirms a mission to realize the true nature of Christianity known to them alone. A little bit arrogant, don't you think? Modernism, like Gnosticism, is characterized by inevitable change. We're just in the cycle. There's nothing that you can do about it. You might as well just get in the process, awaiting cosmic evolution to be realized. So, we don't receive divine revelation, okay? We're waiting for it. We're advancing towards it. Modernism, like Gnosticism, adopts a symbolic understanding of Holy Scripture. So the literal completely disappears. Example, liberal Protestants and modernists agree that the resurrection of Christ is merely a myth. The disciples thought they saw a risen Christ, so you could explain that by hallucination, group telepathy, or some type of a religious experience, some kind of hype. They deny the miraculous. All must be explained by the natural. One other explanation is that, well, Christ didn't bodily resurrect, but he lives on in his disciples. So they're the resurrection of Christ, the body of Christ. Now, there's another point that we need to look at, and that is vital imminence, the third item there. It's not as complicated as it sounds. This is the so-called religious experience of modernism, and this is explained by one of the early modernists named George Tyrrell. quote, "It is always and necessarily we ourselves who speak to ourselves and who, aided no doubt by the immanent God, work out truth by ourselves." Did you get that? Everything is introspective. Okay. Hallett, the author there of the preface of the book, adds, "In plain words, God is ourselves." Okay. So when the modernists use the word God, it's not referring to the transcendent being, the God of Israel or the Trinity, transcendent, separate from, above the material world. Okay. God has created the material world, but for his presence there, it would not stay in existence. That's true. But he is transcendent. He's beyond the world. He would still exist as the world didn't exist. That's what we mean by transcendent. The immanent God is specifically identified with the material universe, the God of who is becoming. That's why God has to always be coming. He's evolving. And so, if pantheism is true, that everything is divine, guess what? So are we. Okay. If everything material is divine, and we're part of the material universe, then we're divine too. Yeah, we're somehow God. In a rather strange parody of the Blessed Trinity, they speak of three modes. Agnosticism, doubt, begets evolution, or becoming, which is halfway between being and nothing. From agnosticism and evolutionism proceeds vital immanence, the religious experience within, faith in the transitory, faith in the future. So, by way of concluding the theological portion, there are serious consequences when you begin to tamper with truth, or deny truth, and deny reality, okay? The supernatural, of course, is compromised, but so are morals. Though not directly taught by the first modernists, we're kind of dealing in the realm of neo-modernism, the new modernism, but the first modernists didn't teach this, but their erroneous teachings implied and led to an attack on Christian morality. Let's look again at Tyrrell's introspection. He taught that we know God, the immanent God, by looking inside ourselves. So if we want to know how to behave, we have to look inside ourselves as well. The morality is determined by a subjective inner feeling. And conscience, incorrectly understood and incorrectly applied, becomes autonomous. It's based on one's own intuition, one's own feelings. So we know that conscience is the mind applied to moral decisions. And so therefore it has to be informed, it has to be taught what is true, what is not. So here in this system, we ourselves become the source of good or evil, and so we've become autonomous. The erosion from this is all around us today, as we see. Okay, we have Pope Paul VI issuing Humanae Vitae, right, for marriage morality, ignored. Not only by the people, but encouraged to do so very often by the clergy. Why? Autonomy of conscience. Abortion on demand, same reasons. And then above and beyond that, the perversity of sodomy and the other perversions that we see, the sins against nature that are occurring today. So, in subsequent talks, we'll be talking about modernist George Tyrrell and Alfred Loisy. We'll be talking about Blessed Pope Pius IX, Leo XIII, and Pius X. Just briefly, sad stories for both of these men. Tyrrell is born in Ireland in 1861 as a Protestant, converts to the Catholic faith. He enters the Society of Jesus. He goes over to England becomes a Jesuit, almost got kicked out because he couldn't obey the rules. Somehow gets ordained, 1891, and he has these rather strange ideas. So somehow the Protestantism, liberal Protestantism got into his mind, and he started applying all of this now to reinterpreting his Catholic studies in this Protestant modernist sense. Just by way of quick summary here, he made the acquaintance of a man by the name of Baron von Hugel, who lived in London, and von Hugel had noticed some of the articles that appeared that had been written by Tyrrell, and noticed that he was very much in the same line of thinking as he was as a modernist. So he got him in touch. He got Tyrrell in touch with other modernists in the mainland. So von Hugel was this behind-the-scenes man who was making connections for these modernists. Tyrrell was eventually censured by his superiors and dismissed from the Jesuits because he would not retract his erroneous opinions. When Pascendi came out, he had publicly attacked the encyclical, and for that he was excommunicated, and he died in 1909, apparently without retracting his errors. Alfred Loisy was a French priest, born in 1857, died in 1940, ordained in 1876. He was a brilliant man, an Oriental linguist specialist. He came under the influence of a teacher in the University of Paris called Abbé Louis Duchesne. And Duchesne was a Christian archaeologist and a skeptic. And so he had embraced liberal Protestant, what we call biblical criticism. Okay, everything is subject to question in the Bible. And so this is how Loisy got involved in modernism. He became a professor at the Catholic Institute in Paris, but was relieved of his position due to his heterodox views in 1893. He maintained, as most modernists do, that the church has to retain its credibility by becoming updated, relevant. He wrote under numerous pseudonyms, and he was eventually excommunicated in 1908, again, apparently never retracting his errors. Okay, more about those men as we go along here. The three popes on our screen are Blessed Pope Pius IX, Leo XIII, and Pope St. Pius X. Briefly, Pius IX reigned from 1846 to 1878, the longest reigning pontiff of 31 years. Pope John Paul II came close for 26 years. He had a difficult time in his 19th century pontificate, fighting against revolution, fighting against liberalism, fighting against modernism in the church. His very first encyclical, Qui Pluribus, November 9th, 1846, he attacks the hostile enemies of the Christian name, free thinkers, who boldly assert that the Catholic faith is a mere invention of men, that the teaching of the church is opposed to the good of society. In numerous letters and encyclicals, Pius IX corrected the errors of rationalism, indifferentism, liberalism, communism, socialism, novelties in theology, and ecumenism. It was of interest that he found out that there were priests subscribing to a movement in England where they brought together all different denominations, and similar to what Pius XI will say when he was invited, the church was invited to join the World Council of Churches. The response was, well, we want unity. And Pius XI and Pius IX preceding him had said, we have unity. It's called the Catholic Church. Come on in and join us, okay? We're not looking for unity, just togetherness. We want unity of doctrine. We want unity of truth. We want unity in the mystical body. That was the response, to this false ecumenism. So there's more on that we can say. Leo the 13th. One other thing with Pius IX was that his greatest contribution in condemning liberalism was his syllabus of errors. And this was a compilation of modernist errors that he had gleaned from his various writings and allocutions over the years. The syllabus presented 80 erroneous opinions concerning the doctrinal, moral, and social and political teachings of the day. And it was well received by Orthodox Catholics. It was not liked by the modernists at all. Okay, Leo the 13th, born in 1810, died in 1903, Pope from 1878 to 1903. He was alarmed by the teachings of Loisy in France, and so he issued an encyclical letter directly toward France, Depuis le jour, since the day, and this was on the education of the clergy. What was happening was men like Loisy and Duchesne and others in France and others in other countries were influencing seminarians and future priests. And so they were corrupting them with all of this doubt, all this liberalism. And so Leo took him to task right away, in one of the first encyclicals. And the modernists reject what we would call scholastic philosophy, scholastic theology, because it's rooted in reality. It's rooted in truth. It's from the Middle Ages, but it was perfected. It was the theology of the church. It was what sustained the faith, not only of the Middle Ages, but right up to the 18th and 19th century. Is that all gone, according to the modernists? So Leo the 13th also had to deal with some problems in this country, the United States, which was called, the heresy was called Americanism. And he had to deal with Cardinals Gibbons of Baltimore and Ireland of St. Paul, policies involving attitudes towards non-Irish Catholics, and then also false ecumenism. There was interfaith compromising going on way back in the 1800s. And then finally, Pope St. Pius X, who reigned from 1903 to 1914, he published the decree Lamentabili Sane in 1907, and this was his syllabus condemning the errors of the modernists. So this is now a development of the doctrines from liberalism of Pius IX to the modernists of Pius X's time. And then it was the syllabus, and then shortly after that was July of 1907, and then in September of 1907 is his wonderful encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis on the false doctrines of the modernists. And when he tried to cull all of the various teachings that they were promoting and tried to explain that how they were wrong. And then some years later, it was discovered that seminary professors and teachers in schools were still carrying on this clandestine, teachings against the faith. He issued what was called the Oath Against Modernism in September of 1910, to be sworn by all the clergy, pastors, confessors, religious superiors, and professors in philosophical theological seminaries. So that also has now been done away with. So, just by way of conclusion for tonight, our study of modernism is important on many levels and for many reasons. Every aspect, every era of church history should be important to us, of interest to us. The church is the mystical body of Christ. And it's described by some theologians as the extension of the incarnation, Christ himself moving through history. When the faith is strong, when the church is faithful, and when it's vibrant, it brings forth the fruits of sanctification of her own members, first and foremost. But it also is the leaven. It is the salt. It is the light to a world always in need of the truths of the gospel. So, if in fact the leaven is not raising, the salt is not seasoning, the light is not shining, the church suffers. But so does the rest of the world as a consequence. Our study of the modernist errors is of vital importance for us today. What others have sown, we are reaping. We don't have to lament. God has placed us in this time of history for his own reasons, his wisdom. And so we're called to do what we can to keep the faith. But we can be sure that in the face of truth, the errors of our day will disappear as clouds before the sun. The truth will prevail. It has to, it will. But we have to make sure that we're preserving that truth. In anticipation of that great bright day, let us personally remain faithful. You know, people can get very upset and very discouraged and very cynical about what's going on in the church. And that's the devil. He wants to tear down any way he can. So we can't submit to that. We have to be strong. And we have to be faithful. So let us make the resolve to pass on the faith, the true faith, once delivered to the saints, to our families, to those of goodwill seeking the truth.